Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
So today I'll be co-hosting the podcast again with our Director of Football, Rebecca Savyuk, and we're going to be talking to our guest, Dr. Katrine Krieger. So, hi Katrine, thanks for joining us.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me on.
No problem. We're really looking forward to speaking to you. So today we're going to talk about injuries in women's football. We're going to hopefully look at the factors that might be contributing to this and the role that technology can play in the future. But before we do, can you give our audience a brief background to yourself, Katrine?
So my background, I have 3 different degrees: sports rehabilitation, biomedical engineering, and then I combined those 2 in a PhD at Loughborough on football boots in the sports technology department, looking at sort of testing football boots and sort of balancing out the medical and the engineering side of things. And then went into academia afterwards and worked in sports medicine, focusing very much on the football medicine side, and it sort of shifted to the women's side of the game very much so. And I've recently joined FIFA as a medical researcher there and sort of leading the women's side of the game in terms of research from them.
Perfect. So we've got the perfect person to come on and speak to us about women's injuries and technology, so we can get straight into things. So just to get things started, there's been lots to talk about women's injuries within football. ACLs is a particular thing, and as I mentioned before we got live with this, 2 days ago I got the results of an MRI scan and I have a full rupture of my ACL. So it isn't just women, it is everybody. So yeah, you can tell me all about the pain I'm going to go through, but let's start with like the prevalence of women's injuries. How prevalent are things? Is there a difference between men and women? What do we know so far?
Yeah, well, there are definitely differences, and I think it's not necessarily just that things are worse in women, which is often the way it comes across. So we know, for example, that hamstring injuries are more common in men's football compared to women's football, and we know that ACL injuries are more common in women's football compared to men's football. Overall, we see a slightly higher incidence rate, so number of injuries for women, and it takes longer for them to sort of recover from the same types of injuries. And you can then question, whether that is based on the anatomy and the genes and so on, or whether it's actually more a question of the way we treat women's football currently. So, taking longer to rehab, is that likely to be because you have less staff, less experienced staff working in the women's game compared to the men's game? There are differences, but whether or not it's because they are women or females based on sex, or whether it's the gender, so the nature or the nurture, is probably an interesting question.
Do we have, and this is a random question to you, we may not have any info on this, but do we have this kind of details from the general population? Like, is there a difference in recovery general population? Do we know that at all?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure whether you can actually look at that. I've not looked at it into details of recovery from surgeries and so on, but it's an interesting point.
It only comes up because I get the privilege of speaking to lots of people, and recently done a podcast on the National Rehabilitation Centre and how they're trying to move things forward with rehab. And they talked about people returning from rehab from military being at the highest level and the best return to actual military action. And then the second best being sport, and people actually returning to sport, and then general population being pretty poor in terms of returning to action. So it'd be really interesting to kind of know that. So anyone listening wants to look at that and compare that, let's find some of that out so we can compare this. So let's go into some detail of some of those things specifically around women then. What is the current thinking out there with the ACL injuries for females? Why is this happening?
So I think we can put this into different perspectives, right? So if you ask the media, it seems like, every female football player is getting an injury at the moment, and that's the way it's portrayed in the media. I think one of the key things they are flagging is that a high number of the players who were nominated for the Ballon d'Or, so the best players in the world, I think 20% of those had an ACL injury in 2022, which is high. I agree with that. But as we all probably know, you can't do epidemiological studies on a sample size of 20 people. You can't say, okay, well, I've got 20 grandparents here and I'm going to see how many of those have a certain type of cancer. We need thousands of people to actually do reliable data sets for injury risk or incidence rate. So media is portraying it as if it's very, very high, and sometimes sort of mentioning that it's 6 to 8 times higher than men's football, which is not true when we look at the data. And I've sort of just recently gone through like all the sort of most reliable sources where they compare men's and women's, and it is 2.5 to 3.5 times higher. So it is higher. I'd say approximately 3 times higher in women, and that's probably, well, it is too high, and that means that on average, a professional team will see 1 injury per season in the ACL. So some teams will not see any, and some teams will see 3 or 4 if they're really unlucky, but averaging out to 1 per team per season.
And we can discuss kind of a number of injuries. Surely, are there other injuries where that's the case as well? So I know we spoke previously about concussion or muscular injuries. Is there a difference there with males and females?
Yes, yeah, there are differences. Ankle sprains we see more in women. Concussions, I think the key thing with concussions, yeah, we see more, but we also see a longer return from the concussion. So the official guidelines are often setting like a guidelines on number of days to return. And I think as a female, you'd have to be very cautious and actually look at like returning without symptoms. So not necessarily just accepting that a guideline for both men and women will work equally well for both.
And so, Bex, what have you experienced this? You worked in men's football, you've worked in women's football. Have you experienced this on the ground, that there is a difference, there isn't? What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just listening to some of the comments, and I think what I like that you've done straight away, Kat, is like demystify that it's not that dramatic high percent that the media are portraying. 3 times more likely, 1 in a season is very fitting to where the Loughborough Performance women's teams were last year in terms of their statistics. So, for example, we had 1 player pre-season sustained an ACL, but I don't think it was a contact one. So, it was like foot planted, knee twist, the overextension, and ended up in an ACL. She's only now, it's almost a year to the day coming up where she sustained that. It was July the 17th last year, to getting on a ball and like running. So it's been a long road to recovery. So and I think with these injuries, in my mind, it's not just the physical part of that. It's what does it do to that human being away from football? The loss of identity, the struggles emotionally. How do they stay connected to the team? In some of these contexts now, they're living with their teammates, right? So their teammates go off, they're high, and they're becoming further and further detached, sense of belonging, teammates, purpose. And I think it's a really dangerous place that an athlete can find themselves. And that's when they'll turn to perhaps unhealthy habits and like poor mental health and well-being and. So so I think that's a really interesting start. More broadly, outside of Loughborough, women's football has moved on a huge amount, like in terms of infrastructure, resources. I would think there's a general consensus we're moving in the right direction. But it's pretty shocking reality to me that Arsenal women, as an example, had so many ACL injuries this year. Like Leah Williamson, bang. Beth Mead, bang. Vivian Miedemar, bang. So they got the spotlight shined on them, and I'm sure there's like a real inquest internally, the media obviously shining spotlight on them. But what it has done for women's football everywhere is, people are starting to go, have we got this right? Is there more we can do? We need more research. This shouldn't happen. What can we do? So sometimes, unfortunately, the stark reality is, it depends who it happens to. If it happens to someone really high profile, right? Leah Williamson, the England captain, is no longer going to the World Cup. The attention that brings about, this interest and currency for us to really deal with it, tackle it, and start to think about how we're going to solve it. So sometimes it's like who it happens to makes a big difference. And the media attention, as difficult as that is probably for the individuals and the club and people who have, you relive injuries. So if you'd had an ACL yourself, Martin, you're probably going, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Like, it's not a nice thing to happen, right? It's important for us to move on like we'll only get better through identifying this and drawing attention to it. So it's like a bit of a double-edged sword for me. We need this to move on, but it's not a nice thing to have to delve into.
When you were touching on the year to return, I know this, but even when you were saying it, you could probably see my face going, "Rrr." And then you start talking about identity. Like, my little boy wants to play football with me in the back garden. I coach their football team. It was 2 days after my 41st birthday when I'd said, I might stop playing soon. I feel like I'm waiting to get injured. I genuinely said that the day before. And then bang, it's injured. Then you're like, I really want to play. Having said I might stop playing, I was like, no. And then it's like a year's time that I'm going to have to readdress that. But anyway, it's not about me. You touched upon lots of real cool things there around some of the factors that might be impacting them. So I'd potentially like to start, like, hypothetically around the Arsenal piece that you spoke about there, or around what are those factors around infrastructure and facilities and things. So are there some of those pieces that might be playing into this? Katrine, is there any research around that, or or opinions around this?
Opinions, yes. Research limited, and that's what we need. We need to sort of understand how these, like, infrastructure elements can impact risk of injury. So, as I said before, a lot of the focus has been on, like, the female body, and claims of the female body being weak and not designed for football. I'm not sure the men's body is designed for football either, but excuses have been very much around menstrual cycle and hormonal fluctuations. It's been very much around wide hips, and hence they can't land from jumping and so on. Like, it's nothing to do with that. It's about training the women so that they are strong and they can move properly. And a man who's untrained would land poorly as well and be at higher risk of ACL injuries. But then when we go into those, like the environment and sort of the everything sort of surrounding women's football, then yes, there's, like, logical reasons why, not having appropriate gym facilities, not having the, like, best quality or high enough number of staff available to do injury prevention programs, not having the time to do that because you don't have as much time with the team for many women's teams compared to men's teams. So you might not prioritize these injury prevention strategies. There's a whole culture around how women exercise versus how men exercise. So women like to, and now I'm generalizing big time, but like to do yoga and Pilates, where men like to go into the gym and lift heavy things. And if you go to the gym, you can see a clear divide in who's going where. And we need to make sure that women understand that if they want to do sport and minimize the risk of injury, they need to probably lift heavy things and do these exercises that yoga and Pilates is simply not enough. And then going on to things like, the quality of the football pitches, which is also environment. So things like in Women's Super League, a lot of the teams will play, or they all play at stadiums that are also shared with men. And the men will come in and play on the Saturday, then the women come in on the Sunday when the pitch is worn out from the day before, and there'll be holes and lumps, and it will not be at its prime conditions that it was the day before when the men were playing. So we're actually offering lower quality facilities for women compared to men quite often, and same for training facilities in clubs. Women are often just placed at the pitch furthest in the back, with the closest to the trees where there's uneven surface or whatever it might be. So there are definitely some gender inequalities in terms of that sort of play into that injury risk.
And there's so many where to start with all that, because there's so many things there. There's probably another one that I would ask the question around training load and a potential of, and this is me, shooting from the hip, really thinking about the professionalization of women's sport and how quickly that's moved, and how the intensity of games may have increased, and whether training load has increased with it or at the right level. Are you bringing athletes in who aren't quite prepared yet, and throwing them in at a higher intensity and too much football? Is that something that could also play into this?
Absolutely, and I think there are two elements to that. There's the whole sort of preparation of female players. So academies not really having been like much of a thing, and so we have a lot of women who go in and play, and like suddenly they have to play at a very high level and do a very demanding sort of daily activity in these elite scenarios, coming from a very amateur setup before. And then, as well as you say, the game is improving every year, and that's amazing. Like, more games are getting faster, players are getting fitter, there are more games every season. The better you get, the more games you play, because you start playing international, you start playing international tournaments as well. So it's a very positive thing that can have a negative impact on the game. And the question is, how do we balance that out, and how do we even measure it? Because at the moment, these are things that we say, okay, it makes sense. If you increase your workload, you're at higher risk of injury. But we haven't actually measured, is it the ones that are playing the most, having the least breaks, training the most, who are getting injured?
Yeah, it's always all good questions. I mean, I don't know, Rebecca, whether you know this or whether either of you do, around for girls going through like an academy or the development that's happening. Like, how many hours a week are they getting to then jump into a first team? Is there a big jump there? Because obviously there's quite a structure in that within the boys' game. What's the difference there with the female game?
Well, it's a tough one, right? Because it's one thing is how we do things in the UK, and like how things have changed a lot recently as well. So it is normally evenings, whereas boys' academies will have a school with them, so they will train and play and do the school stuff all together. So they have that easy structure where women will then have to go and train in the evenings for a couple of hours. But we're talking England here. Like, the Women's Super League is full of international players who come from leagues where it's not way less developed. So they would be like coming from more of an amateur sort of background than what we see in the UK, which is already not good, like anywhere comparable to what we have in men's football.
So what does the infrastructure actually look like, right, in women's football? So we've got the Super League, so the number one league in England, which is full time. So most of those athletes will be on a full-time wage, which that could be anything from £16,000, which means they've got to supplement that with jobs and travel and where am I going to live, all the way up to top earners, which might be what bracketed £60,000 to £100,000 a year, possibly, right? So a lot more kind of able to focus solely on training, and they are a professional athlete. Then you drop down to the championship. Love this word, this gets thrown around loads. We do a hybrid model. Right, okay, but what does that actually mean, right? Is that you training in the evenings? Are you training in the day? Is there like two of you training in the day? You want them to come in Saturday morning to do match day -1, but are you paying them to do that? Like, what does hybrid actually mean? And then that's linking into what you're saying, Kat, because then I'm thinking, God, are the staff hybrid? Are they full-time? Are they part-time? They're going to, can we afford to get the best staff in that environment? It opens up a lot of that level of inconsistency, all the way down to, then we've got the tier 3, and tier 3 are working on part amateur, you don't get paid, and they would classify themselves as an amateur league. However, the last 2 years we've seen the inconsistent nature of player contracts come in. So athletes are now, you might earn, Newcastle this year have gone full time at tier 3. So what does that look like? How much money? What's the infrastructure? Those athletes will be experiencing, Kat said there, low training ages in their academy setups. Bang, you're full time, and that's happened overnight. So that, and do you have you got the staff expertise in there to help the transition? How are you tracking and loading and monitoring it? Because for me, I see performance coaches and sports scientists. You might be excellent in the gym. You might be excellent with the GPS. You might be excellent with the well-being tracking. You might know a bit about menstrual cycle, but how do you actually, those people are like unicorns, by the way, who can do all of those things well. And then if you find one of those, you have to pay them well. So it's so difficult. So these are the kind of thoughts that were going through my mind, and I'll just go lay it down because we're talking about academy football. So the infrastructure this year for the first time has changed again. So the FA have got pro game academies that are coming in to anybody. You could apply for one if you were in the Women's Super League or the Women's Championship. You could get a pro game academy. So your young talent from the ages of, let's say, maybe 17, 18 up to maybe 21. I mean, you might go for a 23s model, but probably not the desirable. I'd imagine most will go under 21s. And I was reading, and we had a call recently with I think it's Stacey Ellis and her PhD students up at Leeds, and they've done longitudinal data analysis of the physical game demands of the pro game academy games from last year, and started to look at trends. And what we're seeing is there was a couple of fascinating findings that have come out there that we were taking on board as Loughborough coaching staff to think about, you know, the points you've brought up there, Kat. One, in that space, the training that was being delivered didn't match the game. So we're not physically preparing the athletes. And then where we've had dual reg players on loan from us from these spaces this year across 3 different academies, their loading and their game outputs across all of the KPIs in the GPS, you know, total speed, high repeat sprint, accels, decels, total distance covered, was all significantly lower than a tier 3 game. So then there's this component where they're going from youth football PDP, women's football, and who's managing and overseeing that, and who's looking at how robust this athlete is, who's supporting that. And then we've got into this difficult space this year for the first time ever at tier 3, where there's not a huge amount of resource like we've got in the Super League to navigate this space, which is the parent club wants them to play. Okay. The dual reg club wants them to play. So some of these young players between the ages of 18, 19, their week was looking like this. Train Monday night, train Tuesday, play Wednesday, train Thursday, train Friday, day off Saturday, play Sunday. So we're increasing the opportunity and the probability for injuries to occur because that's where we've ended up in that space.
I'm glad I asked that question because you've gone into that in some real good depth, and it clearly shows that there's huge issues in being able to kind of both develop and get, you know, because like we said, that the women's game is improving, and the intensity and you know, and all that's improving, the opportunity to play is improving. So that's a great thing. How, you know, I don't think anyone really knows the answer of how you can prepare an athlete properly and well for that jump, and what is the best way of doing that, because you do need the training to get to that level, but you also can't miss out on playing in that level. So there's a lot of management and a lot of infrastructure required to attempt to manage that well, and that could be a huge factor in what's causing many of these injuries. As you mentioned before, there's other factors as well. So what about facilities? So you mentioned gym facilities. You mentioned the playing surface and going in on a Sunday after the men's game have played. How is that with training as well? So I know there's some evidence out there around 3G pitches and grass pitches. Could you kind of touch upon that?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. And I think overall, the current literature sort of states that, you know, as long as you're used to playing on a surface, the overall injury risk is similar, whether it's 3D or whether it's grass. But if you ask players generally, they would say that they get injured more on artificial pitches, which is quite interesting. The injuries that we see happen is when you change. So your body will get used to a certain level of traction, and so interaction with or grip with the surface, and when you then go and change, your body will have to adapt to it. So especially if that's getting higher, you might end up getting stuck in the surface, or vice versa. If you go to like some attraction that's pitch that has lower traction, you might slip, and those are risk factors for different types of injuries. With that comes as well that you should match the football boots with that surface. So if you wear the same pair of football boots on both surfaces, the traction is going to be very, very different. So you can minimize the difference in traction by adjusting the outsole. So most listeners would probably be aware that you can buy football boots with different types of outsole. So you have soft ground, like hard ground, and firm ground, and then you have the AG or the artificial ground ones as well, which you wouldn't see many players actually wearing. Soft ground has long studs, very few of them, and then it sort of trickles down to more studs, shorter, and that alters the way that your boot interacts with the surface. An important thing to mention there is that, you know, soft ground, hard ground, firm ground is designed with men as the normative value. So women are lighter, they don't run as fast, they don't have the same muscle mass. We have a higher incidence rate of injuries, ACL injuries, where you tend to have the mechanism of getting stuck in the ground when you're turning and changing direction. So all of these things need to be considered when you design a football boot for women. At the moment, and I'm not talking about the latest sort of releases of women's football boots here because I don't have the data on them, but generally speaking, if you have a men's size 10 football boot and you have a women's size 5 football boot, they will have the same number of studs, the same length of studs, so there's not a scaling down of the length of the studs depending on whether it's a size 10 or size 5. So relative to the size, a size 5 football boot is actually higher traction than a size 10. And it should be the complete opposite, because a lighter, smaller person will probably need less traction than a bigger one. So there's some things there that definitely needs to be considered for manufacturers to optimize football boots for women and minimize the risk of injury.
That's massively interesting, and I want to kind of start touching a little bit more on the footwear side of things, and any info you've got from research or anything else, and Bex, any examples that you might have from players and anecdotal. I fit the statistics perfectly there though, because I got injured in January with a hamstring injury playing on grass, and then I did my ACL playing on 3G, although it was a tackle, it wasn't a turn or anything like that. If I'm honest, it was a bad touch, and when your second touch is a tackle, it's probably time to quit. So that was the problem. It wasn't a foul. It was a, there you go. So I do fit the stats with all that kind of stuff. And I'm also old, so I wear Adidas World Cups, and they're what I wear on grass, and I wear Copa Mundials on 3G, and I've been wearing them since I was about 14, and that's quite a long time ago. So I look at some of these football boots nowadays and see the kids, especially these new ones. I mean, there's a couple of lads in my team who are now kind of they're under 7, moving into under 8s, and they're in academies now, some of them, and they're being asked to wear like slip-on boots. I can't get my head around that. I've never worn any. I can't get it in my head. And then how thin some of these boots are. If somebody was to stand on my foot, I'd be like, no, I can't handle it. So from a research perspective and kind of practical side, how have boots changed? And is this kind of, is there a lot of positive change in the technology here? Or is it kind of fashion? Is it, do we really need to be as light as they are? Is that making a huge difference? Like, go from there. What have we got?
Well, Martin, that's a great question. And I'm really glad you asked that question, because it is one of the things that really winds me up. Because you see all the marketing from manufacturers being around performance. So you have, as you say, these very, very lightweight football boots that probably break within the season because they're so thin and the materials are so fragile, and all with the story that it's going to make a player faster. Generally speaking, very rough like numbers here, approximately around the weight of 250 grams is where you see no difference. Anything below that, you see no difference in running economy. So it's definitely not going to make you any faster running in a lightweight football boot versus a normal football boot, because they'll all be within that like average weight. And then on top of that, when I did my PhD on men's football boots, we looked into these lightweight designs and compared it. So we basically took a lightweight design and a normal design, scanned underneath the foot to see what the pressures look like. And because of the thin outsole of the lightweight boot, we could see a lot higher plantar pressure. So pressures underneath the foot in certain areas. And we got the players to like simulate a football game for 90 minutes in one boot, which is the lightweight sort of uncomfortable boot that I sort of hypothesized that uncomfortable, and a normal football boot. And over the 90 minutes, in the last 20-30 minutes of the game, the players actually got slower because of increased discomfort and were less explosive. So these like speed boots actually make you slower if they are uncomfortable. What will make you fast in a game is wearing something that's comfortable and fits you.
I like it. So if I do make my comeback, I will be sticking with the Copas and the World Cups. So that's a positive. Have you done anything around these? Because there's a couple of academies telling the kids at 7 years old that you've got to go and buy some slip-ons because they've basically had enough of tying kids' shoelaces. Do you know anything around the kind of slip-on boots that are out there now? Is there any research on them?
So again, it comes from that theory that, you want a really tightly fitted football boot. It makes sense in the sense that, you need it to sit tightly so that you don't slip around in it when you're changing direction, and you need a good like sense of the ball. But with that comes as well that if it's so tightly fitted, you need to have a proper fit in the boot. So if it's poorly fitted and sits extremely tight around your foot, it will cause discomfort, like that sort of micro trauma of constantly squeezing tissues can over time actually cause injuries, and obviously decrease performance or prevent you from actually playing football if you get injured. So like much more important to wear something that fits you rather than something that looks cool and that, you know, like you're being told to wear because it's the appropriate thing for you because it'll make you faster or whatever the claim is. I think I like to make a comparison with how we choose running shoes. So when you go into a running shoe shop, you go in and there's a wide range of running shoes, and they will ask you, okay, what type of runner are you? You run, like, are you heel striker, are you forward striker, how's your arch? You know, you have a treadmill to go and run on. So you buy a running shoe that fits you, and you know, what surface are you running on, you know, all of these things. So it's really, okay, what am I, like, what kind of runner am I? Going into a football boot shop, you would go in and you'd have images of the biggest players, and you'd be like, okay, who do I want to be? You know, do I want to be fast? Do I want to be really technical? Do I want to be this tough centre back who wears a leather boot because he's that kind of guy? And I'm saying he because there's very few adverts with actual women on for football boots as well. So with football boots, you're buying a dream. You're buying what you want to be and not who you are. So, you know, an average game, you run around 10 kilometers, like, you know, like up to 10 kilometers. When you go running, like a lot of people wouldn't even go for 10K when they put on their well-fitted running shoes. But we go and wear something that's really uncomfortable because we want to be something we're not necessarily on the football pitch. So I want to flip that idea in people's heads that they have to wear a football boot that is well fitted for them, and that is by far the most important factor for comfort, for performance, and for minimizing injury risk. You shouldn't buy a football boot just because your idol wears it, your coach tells you that that's the right boot for you because you play this position. There's no such thing as like improving performance in that football boots, like making sure the outsole is appropriate for the surface and wearing something that fits your foot, and then you should be at the best position possible in you sort of picking an appropriate football boot.
There's loads of great points there, and going back to like the comfort side of things. Like I said, I've wore Copas and World Cups forever. My best mate does not like football, and he once put my football boots on and was like, "These are unbelievable! Like these are like really comfortable," and was shocked at how comfortable a pair of football boots could be. And Bex, I saw you nodding in appreciation of World Cups and Copas. It's one of those things with like coaches, or anybody walking around like who's a bit old like us, you kind of give a bit of respect to other people who've got Copas or World Cups on. And if somebody was rocking up in whatever those pink Nike, whatever they are, things, you'd be like, what are you doing? In my world anyway. So what's happening in on the ground in women's football with respect to football boots, Bex? Are you experiencing it? Is everybody wearing the modern lightweight boots? Has there been any change in kind of perceptions around that? What's actually going on?
Yeah, look, firstly, mine, I'm a Copas person as well. I've been wearing Copas for years, maybe since around the age of 22 now. But I was always drawn to the comfort that's the reality. I did, full disclosure, I did buy a lightwear pair of Nikes with like the super thin, almost like plasticky, like layer to them. I wore them once and they just pinched. They pinched at the top, do you know, like where you bend your foot, and they were so tight. And they really weren't for me at all. So I spent a lot of money and then wore them once. But also, as a coach, right, guys, if you come out in a flashy pair of boots, you do get the Mickey taken out of you. So that is, just consider that. If anyone's going to invest big on a pair of bright, shiny boots, you do open yourself up for to be the brunt of the joke at training. So bear that in mind. I think we still live in a world sometimes where some academies have got like a black boot policy, which I find, again, quite interesting in terms of like a Star One choice. Want people to have a perceived professional identity, and that means black boots. During my time at Watford Academy, I think early on that was part of it. One of the academy managers was big on that. when that guy moved on, it opened up a little bit for like the next 4 years, and the boys would have every year 1 or 2 pairs of brand new boots bought by parents, and they were just for fashion. Do you know, like they were the best boots, or you know, these are the ones Messi wears or Ronaldo wears. And it is a big thing. You come, and as a coach, it's part of my job to go, hey, Henry, you got new boots on? Those are looking smart, you know, because the kids are excited about their boots. And the colorways have changed. So, you know, I was seeing more and more young men in pink and purple boots, which is, I thought, again, that was pretty cool. I've got one more comment and then one question for you, Kat, as you was talking. I think, to me, I feel like, is it not common sense that women need a women's specially designed boot? ? Is that not common sense? And one of the brands that has been doing this for a while, with very little media attention, is Ida. Like, they've been designing women's football boots and talking and shouting about this for a really long time. Ida, a few years ago, sent me a pair of boots just to try. They were the comfiest boots I ever put on, right? Ever. However, again, maybe the fashion part of him let them down, because I got a few like, oh, what are those, Bex? What, they're a bit. So again, I didn't spend long in those because of that bit in that environment, but they were unbelievably comfy. And I think that's where I would hope more brands go, so we minimize injuries. So my question to you, Kat, is what do we actually need to move this forward from research in women's boots, but if we were to call to action, like the brands, like the big brands like Adidas, Nike, Puma, what do we actually need to see happen in this space?
It's a great question, and I've been working on this I've not just been sitting and moaning about it. I've actually tried to do something, and I can talk a little bit about it. It's still under review, and the European Club Association, who's funded my project on women's football boot, we have an agreement that I can't share everything just yet. I need to sort of publish the data first. So, but we've shared some numbers, so I can share those with you guys. So first thing that we found, you say, don't we need a football boot for women? And yes, we do. We took us like a foot, images of feet from different angles, and gave it to 350 top players around Europe, and asked them to circle if you have any discomfort or pain on a daily basis in your football boots. 82% of them circle somewhere on that image of the feet. So vast majority of footballers, elite women's footballers, who you'd think, this is their tool, this is what they wear when they go and work, and then they're wearing something that's uncomfortable or even causing pain. It's just simply not good enough. So yes, I think that number sort of quantifies the fact that we need women's football boots. And it's so nice to see, I've followed Ida, I've tried to help them where I could, and in their sort of philosophy of getting that women's football boot out the market. And I'm really, really happy to see that bigger brands are following that trend now. What I want them to do is not do a marketing trick and say that this is a women's football boot, because obviously there's no such thing as like criteria they have to meet to say that it's a women's football boot. What I want them to do is actually have data and use the data to design the football boot around. So what we also did in this project with the European Club Association was we 3D scanned these 350 players' feet and put that together as a database, both with the raw data and summarized data for the manufacturers, and we're going to hand that over to them and say, here you go, please use this. So there's still more to be done. We still need research on optimal traction. So, as I said before, the studs and how we design them for women, we don't fully understand that yet. But hopefully the data set that I've created together with the European Club Association will all start the conversation around the fit. And that will be an important starting point, I think, in designing football boots for women.
That's really good to hear. Really, really good to hear that hopefully this is, taking a step in the right direction with the development of those women's football boots. We're starting to get towards the end a little bit. And I just still want to touch on a few parts around technology and where we might be able to go with technology. Because again, some of the, potentially strange questions, or in my head, fairly obvious questions. One for me would be around footballs and the design of footballs. So there's probably a couple of questions in one here. One would be, has there been a specific design of football for the upcoming World Cup for the women's game, or they're just replicating using a man's ball? And is that actually a relevant question? Like, should the ball be of a different size, different weight? Because female athletes are of a different size and a different weight to males. So is there research in that? Is that a stupid question, or is that a common sense one that I think it could be?
Well, it's not a stupid question. We have adaptations to how we set up the game in most other sports. So, volleyball, the net is a different height. Basketball, the ball size is different. Handball, the ball size is different. Football, we play on exactly the same pitch, with exactly the same ball. So it's a relevant question. There are two sides to this. From my research side, I would say yes, it's relevant to understand what's optimal and whether we need to change things. And my more political side would say, okay, women's football is growing rapidly globally. And if we start saying we need a different ball size, we need a different pitch size, we need a different goal size, is that going to stop the development of women's football in parts of the world where you maybe have to where you struggle to supply that extra equipment for the women's game? Is it better that for now, at least, we play the same game with the same equipment? And then we can always, discuss these things. I don't think, anyone would see a game in the World Cup and say, oh, that ball looks really heavy for her. I think women are able to play with a size 5 ball. There's been some research 7-8 years ago in Denmark from Thomas Bull on playing with a smaller size, so basically a size 4 ball. And he did see improvements in the game around it being a faster game and running economy being faster or better. So there would be changes if you change the ball. I think that's what we know for now, but there's not a lot of research into it, and there's not a lot of from the highest level necessarily an interest in changing things at the moment, because we would probably see negative effects from it as well as positive effects, and that's just how do they outweigh each other?
That's a good answer. That in terms of both that political and that kind of scientific kind of perspective.
For any practitioners working with female athletes in football environments, have you got any little bits of gold dust or little nuggets or one or two best practice recommendations that might help them make some quick wins, marginal gains across any of those areas of football, like Super League, Championship, Tier 3 and Academy football, to maybe just, reduce injuries or help those athletes in those environments?
Yeah, I think the first one is definitely be active, be proactive, do injury prevention. And that is from amateur to elite. There's no level where that's not appropriate. I think amateurs, we've seen really positive effects of things like the FIFA 11 Plus, which can be a little bit tedious to do, but it's about changing that mindset of the players and the coaches of, we want you guys to play football, and for you to be able to play football as much as possible, you need to do other things as well. Welcome them to do gym-based stuff as well at the academy level or amateur level, where it might not be within the infrastructure of the club. And then when we go to the higher level, I'm not saying copying what the men do, far from. We need to sort of understand what injury prevention strategies we should focus on, to what injuries are we seeing in women's football, and how should we work on minimizing them. I think things like, for example, a lot of men's football is focusing on hamstring injuries. We do see an increase in hamstring injuries in women's football, but we don't need to focus as much on it in our injury prevention as we do, for example, stability around the knee and the control around the knee, so that we specifically target the injury risks that are higher in women and not just the generics that we're used to. I'm saying that as well because I know coaches come often from a men's side of the game into the women's side of the game, or they've gone through coaching education, which has been very heavily focused on men's football. And then there might have been a side mention of, oh, women's football is slightly different in this way. But men's football is often the norm in the way we learn things, whether it's coaches, strength and conditioning, the medical staff. So it's not just taking and assuming that what you know is good enough, but also doing a bit of background check on, is this relevant for the players I'm actually dealing with? So women versus men.
Thank you very much for that, Kat. There's no doubt in my mind any practitioner who listens and tunes into this will take something away and can take something away from today and make them think critically about, the practice and their delivery with their own athletes. So thank you very much. Martin, I know you wanted to touch on a bit of the research.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched upon it there, and you've almost recapped with your advice there on what we've been through, which is awesome. I think just to kind of finish off, we could just add what research needs to be done specifically, and almost a call to arms regarding, women footballers and coaches in this environment that might want to be involved in this kind of area, but also, those companies who may have money to fund in this area, or those research organizations who might be able to fund some of this research. If you could kind of speak to them right now, what is the research that needs to be done, and how can we kind of facilitate change?
Well, there are two things in terms of research always. It's quantity and quality, right? So it's making sure we have the good quality research out there to answer the question. So things we've talked about today, ACL injuries. So which risk factors are actually the relevant ones? So at the moment it's a guessing game. I made a list the other day of 30 some proposed sort of risk factors for ACL injuries in women's football. We need to understand which ones are the ones we can do something about and how we can actually minimize it, and how effective are these injury prevention programs in minimizing injury risk as well. So a lot of the research on minimizing injury risk is done on men. So we need to replicate that on women, because we can't assume that it's going to be the same. And then in terms of the technology, so we touched upon, football boots are just being launched from the big manufacturers now. So, I'm not assuming that they will necessarily be perfect first time around. So there will be a lot of research needed on, improving the fit, improving the comfort, improving the optimal traction of the designs, and not just assuming that what a man wants in a football boot is what a woman wants in a football boot. And hopefully they will focus on that, fitting that individual rather than setting a dream sort of perspective that I talked about. So those are the main things, I think, from a research perspective, but I could go on for hours in elaborating on this.
Well, like you said, I could go on to hours talking to you both about loads of this, because it's been really interesting. So, thanks for coming on. I think hopefully our listeners have got a better understanding of women's injuries and some of those key issues. We didn't go down the road of the menstrual cycle at all. So anyone who's interested in that, I have done a previous podcast. I think it's episode 3, which was with one of your colleagues. So it's with Georgie Bruin-Bells and Richard Blakegrove. So those who are interested in that might want to go and listen to that, because we didn't go down that road. But understanding those injuries from a female perspective instead of just leaning on research from a male perspective, I think is a key thing that's come out of here. I think that technology side, particularly around the football boots and the playing surfaces, which feeds into, the amount of stakeholders that are involved in this. It could be those professional sports team and amateur sports teams that need to really look at, well, how are we doing this, and how can we improve the infrastructure around this, the facilities, the coaching staff, the understanding of women's football as an entity in itself, not as an entity of male football. I think that understanding from all those administrative levels needs to be enhanced and increased. And like we've just touched on at the end, the research into much of this, whether that be into the injuries, whether that be into the playing surfaces, or whether that be in actual specifically around the football boots, are all areas that need more deeper understanding. And the prevalence of the women's injuries, and you mentioned 30 different kind of factors that are potential there. They all need looking at specifically to women. So anybody who's got a checkbook and wants to kind of, get it out there to help with the research, anybody who's interested in actually, athletes being involved in the research, administrators being involved in the research, everybody really needs to come together and kind of continue this development of women's football for the good of everybody, for the good of the game. So hopefully that's what I got out of this. So I'm hoping that's what everybody else has got out of this. Massively appreciate you coming on, and I'm sure we can talk again in the future as your research evolves, because it'd be really interesting to see where it goes with you opening up that data to some of those huge manufacturers.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.